Schopenhauer's most dangerous discovery wasn't about his reputation as the philosopher of pessimism. It was about a fundamental truth that once seen cannot be unseen, a truth about existence that most people spend their entire lives desperately trying to avoid. In his solitude and profound contemplation, Schopenhauer documented a universal condition we all experience, but few can name: the realization that we live trapped in an endless cycle of desire and suffering, where nothing is ever truly enough. Those rare individuals who manage to perceive this wheel of perpetual wanting inevitably grow distant from the pleasures others chase endlessly. Not because they possess superior intellect, but because they've glimpsed a reality that carries an immense psychological burden. Today I will reveal Schopenhauer's most profound insight about the nature of human existence and why understanding it may be the beginning of your liberation or the deepening of your existential despair. The promise I make to you is simple but significant. By the end of this exploration, you will understand why Schopenhauer believed that seeing reality clearly is both a curse and the only path to authentic freedom. You'll discover why those who truly comprehend his philosophy find themselves standing apart from the crowd, carrying a weight of perception that others cannot or will not shoulder. This understanding won't make your life easier, but it may make it more meaningful, more authentic, and perhaps in a specific way that Schopenhauer himself identified, more peaceful. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in 1788 in Danzig, to a wealthy merchant father and a mother who would later become a popular novelist. From an early age, Schopenhauer seemed destined to perceive what others missed. His father wanted him to become a merchant, but after his father's death, possibly by suicide, the young Arthur abandoned the commercial path to pursue philosophy. This decision would lead him to develop one of the most uncompromising philosophical systems in Western thought, one that refused to look away from the harsh realities of existence. What makes Schopenhauer's vision so rare and so difficult to bear is that it strips away the comforting illusions most people rely on to make life tolerable. While most philosophers of his time were celebrating reason, progress, and human potential, Schopenhauer proposed something radically different: that beneath all our rational justifications and intellectual constructs lies an irrational, insatiable force he called the will. This concept, central to understanding the burden of clear sight, is not merely an abstract philosophical idea, but a profound recognition of the driving force behind all existence. The central problem Schopenhauer identified is this: we are fundamentally driven by a blind, aimless will to live that constantly creates desires which, even when satisfied, provide only momentary relief before new desires arise. This perpetual cycle of wanting, brief satisfaction, and renewed wanting constitutes the essence of suffering. Most people never fully recognize this pattern because doing so would be psychologically unbearable. Instead, they chase one goal after another, believing each achievement will finally bring lasting happiness, never realizing they are trapped on an endless treadmill. The moment of revelation in Schopenhauer's philosophy comes when we recognize that this will is not just a personal psychological phenomenon, but the very essence of reality itself. Everything in nature, from the gravitational pull of planets to the growth of plants seeking sunlight, from animal instincts to human desires, is a manifestation of this same blind striving. The will manifests itself in countless forms, but always with the same characteristic of endless, aimless striving. This insight hits with the force of revelation. Our deepest motivations are not rational or even fully our own. They are the workings of an impersonal cosmic force expressing itself through us. Empirical observations support this disturbing view. Look around, and you'll see that satisfaction is always temporary. The delicious meal that satisfies hunger is soon followed by new hunger. The career achievement that brings joy quickly becomes the new normal, pushing us to seek the next promotion. The romantic relationship that seemed to promise complete fulfillment eventually reveals its limitations. Even our attempts to escape suffering through entertainment or distraction provide only temporary relief before boredom sets in again. Schopenhauer observed this pattern not just in human life, but throughout nature. Every organism caught in a cycle of need, temporary satisfaction, and renewed need. The most disturbing aspect of Schopenhauer's vision is what it reveals about the nature of happiness itself. Unlike most philosophers who present paths to happiness, Schopenhauer concluded that positive happiness is actually an illusion. What we call happiness is merely the temporary relief from suffering, the brief satisfaction when a desire is fulfilled before another takes its place. This means that life oscillates not between happiness and suffering, but between suffering and temporary relief from suffering. The implications are profound. If true happiness is impossible by nature, then all human striving for it is fundamentally misguided, based on a fundamental misunderstanding of existence itself. Schopenhauer grounded this pessimistic view in both philosophical reasoning and observations of the natural world. He was heavily influenced by Kant's distinction between appearances and things in themselves, arguing that the will is the thing in itself behind all appearances. But unlike Kant, who maintained that we cannot know the thing in itself, Schopenhauer believed we have direct access to it through our own bodies and desires. When we feel hunger, sexual desire, or the will to live, we are experiencing directly the same force that moves the entire universe. This insight also drew Schopenhauer to Eastern philosophical traditions, particularly Buddhism and Hinduism, which similarly recognize desire as the root of suffering. The depth of Schopenhauer's concept becomes clear when we understand that the will operates at multiple levels. At the most basic level, it appears as the forces of nature, gravity, magnetism, chemical reactions. At higher levels, it manifests as the growth and reproductive drives of plants. In animals, it appears as instincts and desires. In humans, it reaches its most complex and self-aware form, capable of abstract desires like wealth, fame, and power. Yet at all these levels, its essential character remains the same, endless striving without ultimate satisfaction. This universal will is not purposeful or rational. It simply is, a blind, aimless force perpetuating itself through all forms of existence. The main danger in truly seeing what Schopenhauer reveals is the potential for a profound existential crisis. If all striving is ultimately futile, if happiness is merely temporary relief from suffering, if the very force that constitutes our being is blind and aimless, what meaning can life possibly have? Many who first encounter Schopenhauer's philosophy experience a deep despair as the comforting illusions that make life bearable are stripped away. This despair is not merely intellectual but visceral, a recognition that the very structure of existence precludes lasting fulfillment. It's no wonder most people intuitively avoid such insights, preferring comforting illusions to this harsh truth. A secondary problem emerges for those who cannot unsee Schopenhauer's truth: alienation from ordinary society. When you perceive the futility in what others chase so earnestly, wealth, status, pleasure, you can find yourself increasingly isolated. Others may perceive your detachment as arrogance or depression rather than clarity. Schopenhauer himself experienced this alienation, living much of his life in relative solitude, finding more companionship in books and his pet poodle than in human society. This isolation is part of the burden of seeing what others cannot bear to witness. The psychological impact of this clear vision varies dramatically among individuals. Some, unable to bear the weight of this knowledge, sink into nihilism or despair. Others attempt to distract themselves, desperately trying to forget what they have seen by immersing themselves in pleasures or work. A few rare individuals, however, find in this very recognition the beginning of a different kind of freedom. Not freedom from suffering itself, but freedom from the illusion that suffering can be permanently escaped through any ordinary means. This realization can be the first step on a path toward what Schopenhauer called the denial of the will. The pattern repeats across cultures and throughout history. Those who see through the veil of illusion, whether philosophers, mystics, or ordinary people who stumble upon this insight through their own suffering, often describe a similar journey. First comes the shock and despair of recognizing the truth. Then follows a period of resistance and attempted escape. Eventually, for some, comes a paradoxical acceptance that contains within it the seeds of transcendence. We see this pattern in Buddha's journey from privileged prince to enlightened teacher, in the lives of Christian mystics and Hindu sages, and in the biographies of artists and thinkers who have faced existence without flinching. The resistance to Schopenhauer's vision is both individual and cultural. Individually, we resist because the truth threatens our most cherished hopes. Culturally, societies develop elaborate systems, religious, political, economic, that promise fulfillment through the very striving that Schopenhauer identified as the source of suffering. Consumer capitalism, with its endless creation of new desires to be satisfied through purchasing, can be seen as the perfect expression of the will in social form. Religious systems that promise fulfillment in an afterlife, if we follow certain rules similarly, defer the confrontation with the nature of existence. Even our entertainment and art often serve to distract us from the truth rather than reveal it. This resistance is not merely philosophical, but a collective phenomenon with measurable effects. Consider how societies treat those who opt out of the common pursuits. The person who renounces wealth, status, and even family ties to pursue spiritual contemplation might be revered in some contexts, but is often regarded with suspicion or pity. The individual who declares that happiness cannot be found through achievement or acquisition is labeled depressed rather than enlightened. Medical systems pathologize the very recognition of life's inherent suffering, treating it as a chemical imbalance rather than a perceptual clarity. Yet despite this resistance, patterns of awakening to Schopenhauer's truth emerge systematically across cultures. These awakenings often follow periods of intense suffering or disillusionment, when the promised rewards of striving fail to deliver lasting satisfaction. Terminal illness, profound loss, or even the achievement of long-sought goals can trigger the recognition that the will's promises are illusory. These moments of clarity, though painful, contain the potential for transformation, not into someone who no longer suffers, but into someone who understands the nature of suffering and thereby suffers differently. Schopenhauer categorized different human responses to the recognition of the will's nature, creating a typology of awareness and reaction that remains remarkably insightful. Let us explore these different types of response, not as rigid categories, but as patterns that may manifest in varying degrees within each of us. The first type consists of those who never glimpse the truth at all. These individuals remain fully identified with the will, pursuing its dictates without question. Their desires feel like their own choices rather than the workings of an impersonal force. They chase wealth, status, pleasure, and power with full conviction that fulfillment lies in these pursuits. When one desire is satisfied, they seamlessly move to the next without questioning the pattern itself. For these individuals, suffering is experienced as the result of specific obstacles rather than as inherent to existence. They may achieve conventional success and even moments of satisfaction, but remain trapped in the will's cycle without recognizing it as such. The second type includes those who get occasional glimpses of the truth but quickly look away. These individuals may experience moments of clarity during periods of suffering or disillusionment, but quickly re-immerse themselves in the pursuit of desires. They might briefly recognize the pattern of wanting, temporary satisfaction, and renewed wanting, but find this recognition too threatening to sustain. Instead, they develop sophisticated rationalizations for their continued striving, telling themselves that this next achievement, relationship, or purchase will be different from all previous ones. They may be drawn to self-help philosophies that acknowledge suffering, but promise its elimination through better striving rather than through understanding the nature of striving itself. The third type encompasses those who clearly see the truth, but respond with despair or nihilism. Having recognized the futility of all striving, they conclude that life is meaningless and not worth living. Schopenhauer was acutely aware of the danger of suicide for such individuals, though he ultimately rejected it as a solution. Those in this category may withdraw from life without physically ending it, minimizing their participation in a game they now see as pointless. They might become cynical observers of others' futile pursuits, finding a bitter satisfaction in seeing through the illusions that motivate human activity. Their clear vision becomes a burden that crushes rather than liberates. The fourth type, the rarest according to Schopenhauer, consists of those who not only see the truth but find in it the path to a different kind of liberation. These individuals recognize the nature of the will, but respond not with despair but with compassion, for themselves and for all beings equally trapped in the will's endless striving. They begin to loosen the grip of their own desires not through forceful repression, but through clear seeing. This clarity allows them to enjoy life's pleasures without becoming enslaved by them, and to endure life's pains without being destroyed by them. For these rare individuals, the burden of seeing becomes not just bearable but transformative. Let's pause for a moment. As we talk about how Schopenhauer uncovered this endless wheel of desire and frustration, I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever felt trapped in a cycle where every achievement, every new possession, every relationship eventually loses its shine and leaves you searching for the next thing? That moment when you finally reach what you longed for, only to realize happiness lasts just a few seconds. I know it's hard to admit, because we live in a world that constantly tells us we should be satisfied, that we should be happy with what we have. But if you dare, leave me a comment saying, "I recognize that cycle in my life when," and complete it with your experience. You are not alone in this. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel understood. Sometimes naming our suffering is the first step to transforming it, and Schopenhauer gives us the language to do exactly that. Let's continue now with how this philosopher reveals an unexpected way to break this cycle. The integration process for those who glimpse Schopenhauer's truth begins with honest acknowledgement. Rather than turning away from the recognition of life's inherent suffering, the individual allows this awareness to fully emerge into consciousness. This stage is often accompanied by grief, mourning for the loss of the comforting illusions that previously gave life meaning. This grief, though painful, is necessary. Attempting to bypass it typically leads back to denial or to a superficial acceptance that fails to transform. The danger at this stage is becoming trapped in despair. Seeing the nature of the will without glimpsing the possibility of transcendence can lead to a paralysis of motivation. Why strive for anything if all striving leads back to suffering? Schopenhauer was aware of this danger, which is why he emphasized that mere intellectual understanding is insufficient. The transformation must penetrate deeper, affecting not just how we think, but how we experience our own existence moment by moment. As integration continues, a paradox emerges. The very recognition that undermines conventional sources of meaning opens the possibility for a different kind of meaning. This meaning doesn't depend on achieving particular outcomes or accumulating experiences, but emerges from a changed relationship to experience itself. The burden of seeing becomes less heavy, not because the truth changes, but because the seer changes, developing the capacity to hold this knowledge without being crushed by it. Another danger appears at this stage: spiritual bypassing. Some individuals, having glimpsed the futility of conventional pursuits, attempt to transcend desire prematurely through willpower alone. They may adopt ascetic practices or spiritual disciplines without having fully integrated the emotional and psychological implications of their insight. Such approaches typically fail because they represent not a genuine transcendence of the will, but another expression of it. The desire to be free of desire becomes just another desire. True integration involves recognizing that we cannot escape the will through an act of will. This recognition leads to a profound surrender, not a passive resignation to suffering, but an active acceptance of what is. This acceptance doesn't eliminate suffering, but transforms our relationship to it. Pain remains pain, but the additional suffering that comes from resistance to pain begins to dissolve. Desires continue to arise, but they no longer possess the same power to define one's sense of self or determine one's actions. Negative examples of this process abound. Consider the spiritual seeker who renounces worldly pleasures only to become attached to spiritual attainments, or the philosopher who sees through conventional values only to develop an inflated sense of intellectual superiority, or the cynic who, having recognized the futility of desire, uses this insight to justify withdrawal from meaningful engagement with life. In each case, what begins as genuine insight becomes co-opted by the very force it was meant to transcend. Positive examples, though rarer, offer guidance for the difficult path of integration. Schopenhauer himself found moments of respite from the will in aesthetic contemplation and compassionate action. He saw in art, particularly music, the possibility of temporarily stepping outside the endless cycle of desire. In compassion for the suffering of others, he recognized a mysterious transcendence of the individual will through the recognition of the same will in all beings. These experiences didn't eliminate his pessimism about existence, but they provided glimpses of what freedom from the will's dominance might look like. Personal transformation through Schopenhauer's philosophy typically progresses through several stages, though rarely in a linear fashion. The initial recognition of the will's nature may come as a sudden insight or emerge gradually through accumulated experiences of desire's futility. This recognition is typically followed by resistance, the ego fighting to maintain its illusions against the evidence of clear perception. As resistance proves futile, a period of disorientation often follows. Previous sources of meaning no longer compel, but alternatives haven't yet emerged. For many, this disorientation gives way to experimentation with different responses to the truth. Some turn to hedonism, attempting to maximize pleasure while minimizing attachment to outcomes. Others explore ascetic disciplines, trying to minimize desire itself. Still others seek wisdom in philosophical or spiritual traditions that acknowledge suffering as fundamental. Through this experimentation, individuals gradually discover what relationship to desire works for them, not as a permanent solution, but as an ongoing practice. As this practice deepens, a more stable transformation begins to emerge. The burden of seeing becomes less about what is seen and more about how seeing itself changes. The individual develops what might be called a double consciousness, fully aware of life's inherent suffering while simultaneously engaged with life's experiences. Desires continue to arise but are held lightly, rather than grasped tightly. Pleasures are enjoyed without attachment, pains are endured without aversion. This isn't a perfect state achieved once and for all, but a dynamic balance maintained through ongoing awareness. The final stages of transformation, which Schopenhauer associated with saints and mystics, involve what he called the denial of the will. This isn't self-denial in the conventional sense, but a profound shift in identification, from seeing oneself as an individual expression of the will to recognizing oneself as the awareness in which the will appears. This shift doesn't eliminate the will's manifestations, but changes one's relationship to them so fundamentally that they no longer constitute suffering in the same way. Warnings and traps appear throughout this transformative journey. The trap of intellectual understanding without emotional integration leads to a split between what one knows and how one lives. The trap of premature transcendence leads to spiritual bypassing and eventual disillusionment. The trap of using insight to feed the ego leads to a subtle form of spiritual materialism, where enlightenment itself becomes just another possession to be attained. The trap of isolation leads to a withdrawal from life that prevents the testing and deepening of insight through engagement with others. Perhaps the most insidious trap is what we might call pessimism porn, becoming addicted to the emotional charge that comes with seeing through illusions. This addiction can manifest as cynicism, nihilism, or a kind of dark enjoyment of others' ignorance. It represents not a transcendence of the will, but another expression of it, the desire to feel superior through one's disillusionment. Schopenhauer himself occasionally fell into this trap, taking a certain satisfaction in his role as the great pessimist who saw what others missed. Maintenance of the transformed perspective requires ongoing practices. Schopenhauer recommended contemplation of art, particularly music, which he saw as the direct expression of the will itself without the mediation of concepts. He also emphasized the importance of compassion, recognizing in the suffering of others the same will that operates in oneself. Modern practitioners might add mindfulness practices that develop the capacity to observe desires without immediately acting on them, or ethical commitments that direct energy toward alleviating suffering rather than pursuing personal satisfaction. The higher integration of Schopenhauer's insights involves moving beyond mere personal transformation to a changed relationship with the world. Those who have integrated the burden of clear seeing often discover a paradoxical freedom to engage more fully with life precisely because they no longer expect life to provide what it cannot, permanent satisfaction or escape from suffering. This freedom manifests as the capacity for joyful participation in life's experiences without demanding that they be other than what they are. This higher integration also involves a shift in values from acquisition to appreciation, from striving to witnessing, from control to collaboration. The transformed individual doesn't stop acting in the world, but acts from different motivations and with different expectations. Achievement may still occur but is no longer mistaken for the source of lasting fulfillment. Relationships may still bring joy, but are no longer burdened with the impossible expectation of completing oneself. Work may still provide satisfaction, but is valued for its intrinsic meaning rather than as a means to some future state of happiness. At the highest level of integration, the burden of seeing what others cannot bear to witness becomes not a burden at all, but a gift. The gift of living in accordance with reality rather than in conflict with it. This doesn't mean suffering disappears, but rather that suffering is no longer compounded by delusion. The clear-eyed individual suffers no less than others, but suffers more cleanly, without the additional layer of suffering that comes from believing things should be other than they are. In our final reflection, we return to where we began, with the recognition that seeing clearly carries both danger and opportunity. The danger lies in the potential for despair when confronting the nature of existence without flinching. The opportunity lies in the possibility of a freedom more profound than any that comes from satisfying particular desires. The freedom that emerges when we no longer mistake the satisfaction of desire for the purpose of existence. Schopenhauer's vision remains challenging precisely because it refuses comfortable illusions, yet in this very refusal lies its enduring value. In a culture dominated by the pursuit of happiness through acquisition and achievement, Schopenhauer offers a necessary corrective. He reminds us that lasting satisfaction cannot come from following the dictates of the will, but only from understanding its nature and thereby gaining some distance from its demands. The synthesis of Schopenhauer's philosophy isn't a neat resolution that eliminates life's contradictions, but a higher perspective that embraces them. It acknowledges that we are simultaneously expressions of the will and the awareness in which the will appears. We are both the desiring self and the witness to that desire. This paradoxical position, being in the world but not entirely of it, constitutes the authentic human condition once the veil of illusion is lifted. For those willing to bear the weight of this vision, a different kind of life becomes possible. Not an easy life, not a life free from suffering, but a life lived in truth rather than delusion. This truth-oriented life doesn't promise happiness in the conventional sense, but offers something perhaps more valuable, the dignity that comes from facing existence on its own terms, neither denying its harshness nor being defined by it. If you've recognized yourself in Schopenhauer's words, if you've felt that endless cycle of desire and disappointment, you're not alone on this path. This channel is a refuge for those who seek to understand the deepest truths of our existence, not to drown in pessimism, but to find authentic freedom. I invite you to subscribe, not as another number, but as part of a community of seekers who dare to look beyond the veil of everyday illusions. Every week we explore these philosophical truths together and how to apply them to find peace in a chaotic world. Leave a comment sharing which aspect of Schopenhauer's concept of the will resonates most with you. I take time to read each reflection and respond personally. And if you know someone who's also searching for deeper answers, share this video with them. Sometimes the knowledge we need most comes through those who care about us. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore how, according to Schopenhauer, art can offer us genuine moments of freedom from suffering. Until then, remember, seeing the truth, however painful it may be, is the first step toward living authentically.